Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has warned that Russian and Syrian military officers could face international sanctions in the wake of the chemical attack in northern Syria. Mr. Johnson was speaking in Italy, where foreign ministers are considering what further action to take against President Assad following the cruise missile strike ordered by President Trump last week. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins reports.
America's Secretary of State is in Italy to turn up the international heat on Syria's President Assad and his Russian backers. Rex Tillerson very deliberately joined an international wreath-laying at the memorial to a Nazi atrocity here in 1944, the massacre of local villagers.
We remember the events of August 12, 1944 that occurred in Sant'Anna.
Then he drew a direct parallel to last week's gas attack in Syria's Idlib province.
We rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world.
Then President Trump's foreign minister, the man who'll go to Moscow later this week, met Boris Johnson, the foreign secretary who cancelled his visit to be here instead. They're working together to get the widest possible internationally agreed challenge to the Russians.
Hi James, how are you? Good afternoon.
Immediately afterwards, Boris Johnson told me he's pressing for new sanctions against Russia as well as Syria.
We will be discussing the possibility of further sanctions, certainly on some of the Syrian military figures and indeed on some of the Russian military figures who have been involved in coordinating the Syrian military efforts and of course who are thereby contaminated by the appalling behavior of the Assad regime. And so what we're trying to do is to give Rex Tillerson the clearest possible mandate from us as the West, the UK, all our allies here, to say to the Russians, this is your choice. Stick with that guy, stick with that tyrant, or work with us to find a better solution.
But President Assad's major backers, Iran and Russia, have now warned of military retaliation if President Trump repeats last Friday's cruise missile strikes. Although Iran's President Rouhani, seen as a moderate, seemed to contradict his own hardliners today, saying change within the Assad regime should go hand in hand with fighting his opponents.
Terrorism in Syria should be eradicated, and of course some reforms should be implemented within Syria, within the Syrian regime.
This evening, G7 ministers, all but one of them NATO members too, are starting to explore new pressures they could apply, knowing full well that Russia has so far stuck firmly with President Assad and his regime. The discussions here will go on deep into the evening and resume in the morning. Whatever's agreed, will Russia and Vladimir Putin blink or buckle? It's not clear that they will, particularly after hearing Rex Tillerson, America's Secretary of State, saying repeatedly over the weekend that the United States' major priority remains not dislodging President Assad, but defeating IS, or so-called ISIS, in Syria. Sophie.
James Robbins in Italy. Thank you.
Now, after the chemical weapons attack and retaliatory US missile strike, Syria is, of course, dominating the conversation tonight between foreign ministers of G7 nations at a summit in Italy. The key issue, Russia's role in the civil war. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will leave Lucca for Moscow to meet with his Russian counterpart at a time when tension between the two superpowers is at its highest in decades. Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
Near the town where the chemical weapons struck, they're painting a mural with a moral.
We painted the wall to say Trump is giving Bashar al-Assad a lesson. It's okay to kill Syrians using guns, missiles, tanks and bombers, just not chemical weapons.
They have little faith that one US airstrike on one Syrian airbase will make much difference, nor that President Trump will prove to be the man who can bring peace to Syria. 2,000 miles away in Lucca, under a mural of the Roman Emperor Trajan, who served as a military officer in Syria, Gaining a reputation for wisdom and justice, G7 leaders are gathering. They say their objection to Russia's support of President Assad is also a moral issue. The British Foreign Secretary, who cancelled his planned trip to Moscow today, making way for his American counterpart, said Russia now has a choice.
That choice is to stick like glue to the Assad regime, with all that entails, that toxic regime that poisons its own people and indeed is poisoning the reputation of Russia, or to work with the rest of the world, everybody represented here at the G7, as well as the like-minded countries, Turkey, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and so on, to work with the rest of the world to find a solution, a political solution.
Before the meeting, the US Secretary of State visited the site of a World War II massacre.
We rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world.
He's hoping to have a unanimous message from the G7 when he visits Moscow later this week, threatening further sanctions on Russia if President Putin doesn't withdraw support from President Assad and push for a new peace process. But unlike when Mr. Tillerson was the head of the oil company ExxonMobil, the Russians say there are no plans for him to meet President Putin himself. And in the end, such visits are about power, not morals. The US administration believing that their use of force will concentrate the Russian government mind. Back in Khan Sheikhoun, they've been burying the dead from last week's chemical weapons strike. To them, a peace process, a political solution, probably seems as far off in the future as Syria's past in the Roman Empire, when the Emperor Trajan held the fate of the country in his hands.
Well, President Trump's top foreign policy staff were out in force over the weekend, but did they shed any light on what exactly the administration's policy is on Syria? Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now. Kylie, can you answer that question?
Well, Kathy, in fact, we've just been hearing from Sean Spicer at the White House briefing, who's been saying that the US holds open the possibility of more strikes. But I think the only thing that anyone can say with any real certainty at the moment is that it's very difficult to extrapolate a coherent policy from the US firing those Tomahawk missiles on Friday. As you say, his foreign policy chiefs were being asked to clarify what the overall US-Syria policy now is at the weekend. They both appeared on talk shows. The US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, and the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, asked for clarity. And here they are. Rex Tillerson first on John Dickerson's Face the Nation.
Well, I think, John, it's important that we keep our priorities straight, and we believe that the first priority is the defeat of ISIS.
Is regime change in Syria now the official policy of the United States?
So there's multiple priorities. Getting Assad out is not the only priority.
It's almost like they're working through this in full view of the public. Of course, regime change a la Nikki Haley wasn't the policy even at the beginning of last week. It's the opposite of what Trump's supporters are expecting. He's already getting some heat from them over this. In fact, I'm not really sure, though, that is the plan insofar as there is one. His generals, like National Security Director H.R. McMaster, are working to explain that it is possible to do both.
And the resolution of the conflict will entail the defeat of ISIS, and then also it has to be a significant change in the nature of the Assad regime and its behavior in particular.
For now, though, the reality is, I think, as Lindsay's already said, that the US really needs the Russians to use their influence with Assad as it ever was. President Trump can't scale up engagement in the war if he wanted to without seeking congressional approval or making the case to the American public. Both hugely difficult, particularly when he's got a whole world of other problems: healthcare, tax, his Muslim ban is frozen in the courts, and there are rumblings of infighting between his family and his closest advisors. I mean, this Syria strike may have been a canny move, but it's unlikely, I think, to lead to wider action. It's most likely an isolated instance of America projecting its power.
Kylie in Washington, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to Qasim Eid, the survivor of a Syrian government sarin gas attack in Damascus in 2013. We started by discussing his own very distressing experience and why, in his view, that should constitute a red line.
I started hearing rockets coming from Damascus after an alarming sound coming also from Damascus. Seconds later, rockets hit the ground. Seconds later, I lost my ability to breathe. I felt like my chest was set on fire. My eyes were burning. Each and every part of my body suffered from severe pain. I choked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. So I started beating my chest again and again until I managed to breathe. I started screaming in agony, and so did the neighbors. We ran to the street to see men, women, and children running, falling on the ground, suffocating, in a scene that I always describe as Judgment Day. I saw a little boy choking, and I went there to help him. And I always recall the look on that little boy's face, his glassy eyes staring in terror into another dimension, that white foam coming out of his mouth, that horrible sound that came out from his lungs while he was suffocating. I tried to help him. I tried to give him CPR. Then my friends in the Free Syrian Army arrived, and they started evacuating the exposed civilians to the field hospital. By the time we got to the field hospital, I lost my conscience, and I lost everything around me just turned black. I went into a coma. My heart stopped. Doctors thought I was dead. They placed me among the dead bodies. My friends came and noticed somehow I was still moving. They called the doctors again. They gave me more atropine and CPR until I woke up. What happened in Syria should never happen again. But because of Obama's broken promise, it happened. And when Obama broke his promise, he broke a lot of hearts in Syria. And he made a lot of people give up on any kind of help coming from international community.
There's been a lot of speculation about exactly why Donald Trump did take action when he did. Why do you think he made such an about turn and took military action in Syria?
I honestly don't know. But what he did, and by striking the criminal Bashar al-Assad, he proved it to the entire world that he's a man with a big, big heart, a lot more than people expected.
If President Trump does have a big, big heart, as you say, why has he taken such a hard line on refugees like yourself?
We are paying for other people's mistakes. I cannot blame people who misjudge us because of other people's actions. We've been suffering from propaganda, from Assad's propaganda and from the Russian propaganda that refugees are bad, that they're all terrorists, that it's either Assad, the secular governor, or the extremists, and that's all incorrect.
Quite a number of the rebels, though, are extremists, aren't they?
No, they're not, ma'am. No, they're not. Everybody, like, I just want to put this in a very simple way. In a country that has over 90% of its populations are Muslims, it's very, very normal to see over 90% of the rebels to be Muslims. I know there's a lot of rumors and a lot of propaganda against the rebels. I know there's some bad people who claim to be rebels, and the rebels fight them.
Qasim Eid, thank you very much for talking to me.
You're welcome.